paloquita de algarroba molidita en el mortero. Se me sube a la cabeza, ay, como si fuera sombrero. Se me sube a la cabeza, ay, como si fuera sombrero.
Good afternoon, book lovers. This is Robert Boyd coming at you. I am testing out a new camera and a new setup, so the angle is slightly different than what you've seen before. You can see my yoga pads on the floor behind me. And I think it's a slightly more wide angle view. I'm not sure if that's better. Anyway, the music you just heard was by Victor Jara, a Chilean folk singer who was executed in the 1973 coup against Salvador Allende by Pinochet goons. And I will get back to him. He's relevant to the story, but let me talk about the book that I'm going to discuss today. It's Neruda, The Poet's Calling by Mark Eisner. And Neruda is obviously Pablo Neruda. He was a Chilean poet. He won the Nobel Prize in, I think, 1966. And this is a long, detailed biography of his entire life. I didn't know it's one of these books that's been sitting on my shelves for a while, and I haven't read it, but I finally sat down and read it, and it's really good. It's really readable. And Mark Eisner is a translator and a scholar of Neruda, and I looked at some of the responses to the book on Goodreads, and one of the people was worried that because of his position as a translator of Neruda, that it would be a hagiography, but I didn't think it was, and so I think, and neither did this other reader. Anyway, Neruda. He was born in 1904 in Temuco, which is a town in the south of not the south of Chile, but the south of Santiago, the capital. But the south of Chile, Chile is not a big country, but it is a long, thin country. So Temuco is only like 2/3 the way down. There's a whole lot more of Chile to go to from the south. Anyway, his actual name his birth name is Ricardo Eleazar Naftali Reyes Basualto. He was the place where he was born was Mapuche country, and the Mapuche were indigenous people of Chile, and they were the last Indians in the American continent, South American continent, not to be conquered by white people. They held out the longest, and when they were conquered, needless to say, they weren't treated very well. They were not allowed to live in the town of Temuco, so Neruda only saw them when they came to market to sell their meager wares. And Neruda was always interested, let me say, I'm going to call him Naftali until he changes his name to Neruda. He was always interested in poetry as a young boy, and started writing pretty much, I think, when he was about 11. And he had the amazing good luck in 1920, when he was 16 years old, to meet Gabriel Mistral, a great Chilean poet who later won the Nobel Prize. She won it before Neruda did. Who came to Temuco to be a teacher. And so he had aspirations, even at 16, to study poetry with a great poet. When he went off to college in Santiago, he started publishing more poems in local newspapers and magazines. He changed his name, his nom de plume, to Pablo Neruda, so that his father wouldn't see that he was wasting his time doing this unremunerative activity of writing poems. His father wanted him to get a job, to study something that could get him a job that could propel him into the middle class. he was pretty much lower middle class in Temuco, but he came from a family of climbers, and he had rich relatives. Anyway, so he started writing poetry in college, and he did. He wrote really well, and it got a following. And he had one book published that was not that well known, but the book that really put him on the map was published. Let me see. I'm sorry. I'm looking this up. I should have it written down. Was it published in 1924? So he was I think he's 21 or 20 or 21 when it was published, and it's this book, 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair. And it's the only book of Neruda poetry I've read, and it's by far his most popular book. Over the years in different languages has sold millions of copies, which, for a poetry book, that's kind of an amazing thing to say. I mean, how many 20th century poets can say that at all? I don't think hardly anyone can. Anyway, so he wasn't making much money off of poetry. I mean, he really wasn't making any money off of poetry, but he was popular. And the 20 love poems are poems to two women that he was infatuated with, and there were one of them was the first woman he ever had sex with, and they're very sexual. And I remember reading it when I was in college. I should have been studying, but instead I was drinking beer at one of the on-campus pubs, and I had a copy of it, a dual language copy. So I forced myself to read it in Spanish, which my Spanish was terrible. It's slightly better then, but it still wasn't good. And I was amazed by how sexy they were. I think that might today have a negative connotation for them. Now the 20 love songs or 20 love poems are all numbered, and that's how they're usually referred to. And that's how they're referred to in the biography. But in this volume, which was translated by W.S. Merwin, each poem is given a title, which is the first few words of the poem. And that usually works. So one of the titles is Juegas todos los días, and the translated title is Every Day You Play, which is an exact translation. But sometimes, the order of the sentence gets reversed, and that can lead to some hilarious translations of titles. One love song or love poem 12 is called, in this book, is called Para mi corazón, so for my heart. But the way W.S. Merwin translated it is the first line becomes, Your breast is enough for my heart. So the title of the poem becomes Your breast is enough, which is hilarious and wrong. And really, they should have just left it as numbers, but oh well, whatever. Anyway, so this was his first big book, and he kept writing poems and getting them published in Chilean publications. But he needed like a real job, like all poets must eventually do. So he got a consular job with the Chilean government, which apparently was a common thing back then. Chile would just give its poets and writers jobs in the foreign service and send them off to wherever, and that would give them enough to live off of. I mean, the consular job he first got was in Rangoon in Burma, which was at the time, and then we're talking 1927, or I guess it was 1927. So we're talking Burma as a British colony before the name Rangoon was changed to whatever it is now. I can't remember, and before the country of Burma was changed into Myanmar. And so, as he's traveling to Burma, and the only way he gets money is if Burma exports things that Chile buys, and he gets like a cut of it. That's how consular officers back then got paid. So and Chile did import some things from Burma, so he was able to squeak by. As he was traveling there, he travels over the Andes to Buenos Aires to take a ship from Buenos Aires to Burma, and he meets Jorge Luis Borges for the first and only time. And apparently they got along great. I mean, even though they never really met again, although they had the opportunity to. And Neruda went to the left and Borges went to the right. And therefore they had political differences. But apparently it was a very genial meeting, at least according to the biography. So he goes to Rangoon as the consul, and he's he's definitely a white guy in a Asian country, an Asian colonial country, and he has like a rather racist attitude towards the Burmese people, and he sees Burmese women as playthings for himself, and he writes about one of them named Josie Bliss, and apparently in his memoir he writes about this woman. But the biographer can find no evidence that there was actually a Josie Bliss. But he in his memoir, he writes that, she was obsessed with him, blah, blah, blah. It all sounds like, Orientalist, sexist fantasy. And I think that reflects really poorly on Neruda. That he didn't subsequently... I mean, he wrote his memoir many, many years later. He didn't subsequently see these people as exploited, colonial subjects. In any case, he's consul there for a while. Then he goes to Colombo in Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon. Then he gets appointed to Batavia, which was the Dutch word for the city that subsequently became known as Jakarta, and it was part of the Dutch East Indies at the time, so it was another colonial outpost. And he finally gets to meet some white women, and he meets and marries one, a Dutch woman who he calls Maruka. And they travel back to Santiago, Chile, and they get married. I think they got married in Batavia, but anyway, they were married. And then he gets a consular job in Spain, which for him is the best possible thing, because he wants to make it as a Spanish language poet, and Spain is still the capital of the Spanish speaking world. So on his way to Spain, he goes through Buenos Aires, and while he's in Buenos Aires, he meets Federico Garcia Lorca, who's there, I think he's putting on a play. But in any case, they get along famously. He becomes good friends with Garcia Lorca. And his daughter is born a year later in Spain. Her name was Malva Marina. And she was born prematurely, and she had hydrocephaly, and she never was healthy her entire life. And while Neruda's in Spain, he meets another woman, Delia del Carrillo, who I think is I can't remember whether she's Chilean or Argentinian, but she's not Spanish, but she happens to be living in Spain. And she is 20 years older than Neruda. And Neruda is still pretty young. He's in his mid-30s at this point. But he is infatuated with her, and so he leaves Maruka and his newborn daughter for Delia. And so the Spanish Civil War breaks out. Garcia Lorca is executed for no particularly good reason. The Spanish fascists looked down on anyone educated. In fact, according to this biography, one of their sayings or mottos was "Death to the intelligentsia." I would say we can expect the same from the Trumpites, except that they don't even notice that the intelligentsia exist. So Neruda's there in Spain while the war's going on. I mean, he's in Madrid while it's getting bombed by the fascists, and writes a poem about it, and the poem's like printed and read on the front lines of the Republicans as they fought against the fascists. But, of course, we know that story did not end well. The fascists win. Neruda has to flee. He ends up in France, and he's lauded there because he's by that time he's a well-known poet in favor of the Spanish Republic, and he's become a communist at this point, although I'm not sure when he officially joins the party. And he helps Spanish refugees. Spanish refugees first went from Spain to France, and France didn't treat them great. I mean, they didn't send them back to Spain, but put them in dirty, unpleasant camps. And many of them ended up in Latin America. A lot of them ended up in Mexico, but a shipload of them ended up in Chile, largely because of Neruda's efforts. So he goes back to Chile. He becomes an outspoken communist, and he starts writing poems that reflect his new point of view, including his magnum opus, Canto General, the General Song, which is sort of a history of the entire continent. Includes what's widely regarded as his masterpiece, although I haven't read it, so I'll just have to take people's word for it. The Heights of Machu Picchu. Anyway, he is involved in politics, and he runs for senator as a communist and is elected in 1945. And the president, who was his ally during his campaign, after World War II, there's the United States is strongly anti-communist and puts a lot of pressure on all its southern neighbors to reflect this view. And some of them, they don't really have to have the U.S. putting economic pressure on them. So, places like Paraguay are already run by fascists, so for them it's not that big a deal. But in the case of Chile, the president, Gabriel González Videla, really starts cracking down on the unions and the communists. And Neruda gets up in the Senate in 1945 and makes an impassioned speech against Videla, known as the Yo Acuso speech. So he's sort of modeling it after Zola's J'accuse letter. And subsequently, a warrant for his arrest is issued because they've just decided that communists are bad and communist senators are intolerable. So he has to go into hiding. He and Delia live underground. And in the meantime, his wife has been in Europe the entire time, all the way through World War II. He does file for divorce from his wife, but she's in Holland and World War II is occurring. She can't really show up and contest it. So it's kind of a bullshit move on his part. So he marries Delia, and he flees over the Andes into exile in 1949, going way down to the south of Chile and taking a smuggler's path by horse over the Andes with some compatriots. Meets some Argentine communists who pretty much living underground themselves. And then he goes and lives in Europe for a while. 1953, Stalin dies. And so Neruda's a communist, and he's a hardcore Stalinist. And really, a lot of people were hardcore Stalinists. I don't want to say it's not bad that he was a Stalinist. I mean, all these people who loved Stalin just had their eyes closed to what a horrible human being he was and the hell he put his country through. So Neruda remains a Stalinist even after Khrushchev's secret speech, says, hey, even us in the government realized Stalin was evil. But by the early 60s, he's not really feeling the Stalinists feel, and he had visited the Soviet Union and China several times, and he won the Stalin Prize, which is the prize that Russia set up to be their own Nobel Prize. But by the 60s, he wasn't, like I said, he wasn't feeling it anymore. He realized that Stalin was bad and Mao was just as bad, if not worse. And he makes a speech denouncing China and Mao because Mao had arrested I King, Chinese poet he had met when he visited China the first time, and whom he considered a friend. And the personal is political for Neruda. I King is probably best known now as the father of Ai Weiwei. But at the time, he was a well-known poet. And he eventually visits the United States, which, he obviously couldn't in the 50s during the McCarthyite era. But by the mid-60s, Johnson and the State Department were like, okay, let's let some communists in just to show that we're open-minded. And so he visits the U.S., has like really successful readings in New York and so on. He's still involved in Chilean politics, although he doesn't run for office, but he supports Salvador Allende in his multiple runs at president. And then in 1970, Salvador Allende is surprisingly elected president. Neruda comes down. Oh, I gotta mention that in 1949 he started an affair with a woman named Matilde Urrutia, and she actually subsequently became his wife. Not that year, but many years later. But she's closer to Neruda's own age, and so I think he might have been feeling the fact that the love of his life, Delia, was 20 years older than he was. So, she's starting to get to be an old lady. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. Having affairs is not cool. But, and Delia apparently didn't know. It's not like they had an open marriage or something. So anyway, he has Delia as is basically his wife, although he's still married in law to a Maruka over in Holland. Then he has Matilda as his side squeeze for most of the rest of his life. But at some point, Maruka dies, and so the charge against him that he's a bigamist can't really exist. So he asks Delia for a divorce, and she grants it, and then he marries Matilda, and sort of in the latter part of his life. After Allende is elected, Neruda becomes ill with prostate cancer. So he's really in bad shape. And then the coup happens on 9/11, 1973. So 9/11 has a very different meaning for Chileans than for Americans. It's brutal, and it's basically, I mean, it's not, it wasn't engineered by the U.S., but the U.S. did everything they could to make sure it happened. I mean, even before Allende became president, they tried to arrange a coup to happen before he took office. And Neruda died 12 days later, after the coup. After they bombed the presidential palace, Allende kills himself to keep from being captured by Pinochet's troops, and then Neruda dies. And there's a little bit in the book about how there's a kind of conspiracy theory that he was executed by the government, but he had terminal prostate cancer, and he was gonna die. So I think that that theory is probably incorrect. Anyway, I do want to read one thing from this book. So Neruda was, he's a poet, so poets don't get paid a lot, but over the course of his life, he got paid quite a bit. And then there's a thing where he had this great house on Isla Negra. I'm going to show some pictures of it because it looks fantastic. It's sprawled out over the side of a cliff, and he viewed it as a ship that was on the ocean. He didn't like going out on the ocean that much. He wasn't like a sailor or anything, but he loved the ocean, and he loved having this house by the sea at Isla Negra. And he had another house in Santiago. And then after he won the Nobel Prize in the 60s, he suddenly had a lot of extra cash. And he decided that he needed a place. So after he divorced Delia and gotten married to Matilda, he decided he needed a place that was all his own, that wasn't where Matilda would live, that he could use to write poetry. And he was a machine writing poetry. So he decided he needed his own home in Valparaiso, a port city in Chile that he knew very well. So as Eisner writes, the communist wanted his third house to be simpler, more modest. Stabbed him right in the heart. He makes a point that basically Neruda and a lot of Neruda's pals were champagne communists. They lived like rich men, even though they proclaimed communist ideals. And that, I don't know, I find that amusing and kind of sad, and something that people can easily point to criticize him. And I think he probably deserves some criticism for that, but he wasn't like, I don't know, he was a hardcore communist, he was a hardcore Stalinist for a long time. But I think, I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said, when someone, said, why do you, stay in 5-star hotels? He said something like, nothing's too good for the working class. He does talk about people who tried to discredit Neruda, and he mentions like an article that appeared in the Weekly Standard, the now defunct conservative American magazine, saying that Neruda was a bad poet and a bad person. And in some ways he was a bad person, because he deserted his wife and daughter, and his daughter died at the age of 8. And he treated Asian women in a kind of an abominable colonialist way. But one of the things that the Weekly Standard said, and other people have said, is that Neruda was somehow involved in the assassination of Trotsky. And Neruda was consul to Mexico, and when he showed up, almost immediately after he showed up, Trotsky was assassinated by a KGB agent from Spain. And Neruda was a Stalinist, so he naturally hated Trotsky, and he was friends with people who hated him so much that he was close friends with Siqueiros, the muralist. And Siqueiros literally tried to assassinate Trotsky with a group of his friends and failed. So it's not a giant leap to imagine that Neruda would be on the assassination scene, but the timing doesn't work. So Neruda, I think, is innocent in that regard, and he's a great poet. Like many great artists, he's a super imperfect guy. And one of the things Eisner does at the end, he talks to young Chileans about what they think of Neruda now. And some of the things they say is like, hey, he was an important figure, but it doesn't speak to me now. He treated Asian women badly, etc. So those are the kind of things you have to think about when you're thinking about Pablo Neruda. But I highly recommend 20 Love Poems and a Song of Despair. They're the kind of poems that you could read to someone that you're about to have sex with, if she's a woman. I don't think they would work if the person you're about to have sex with is a man, because they are very much addressed from a man to a woman. And this is a good biography. I like literary biographies in general, and this one satisfied. All right, thanks very much.